In this short presentation on syntax, I'll be talking about the innateness hypothesis. Before we do that, we should talk a little bit more about the term universal grammar. In a previous presentation, I said one of the goals of the study of syntax was to produce a universal grammar. A universal grammar is a theory of grammar that can describe any natural language. It would be a theory of grammar that is just as useful in describing Japanese as it is in English. According to Radford, a theory of grammar must enable us to devise a descriptively adequate grammar for every natural language. In other words, our ultimate goal is to develop a theory of universal grammar. But why should there be such a thing as universal grammar? Why do we believe such a thing exists? Why should we expect that very different languages that originated, or at least evolved, independently of each other, should have enough in common that a single theory of grammar could adequately explain them? Why shouldn't we expect different languages to be fundamentally different? Not just different on the surface, but fundamentally different, different at the foundations. But here's the thing, we can identify a great number of commonalities, and these commonalities suggest that languages are connected, that all languages are language, and that language is something that is constrained and emerges with reference to a specific set of rules that all languages must conform to. But why is that? We'll get to the answer to that question in a minute. First, another set of questions. Radford says, the central phenomena that any theory of language acquisition must explain is this. How is it that after a long, drawn-out period of many months, in which there is no obvious sign of grammatical development, at around the age of 18 months, there's this sudden spurt as multi-word speech starts to emerge, and a phenomenal growth in grammatical development takes place over the next 12 months? An answer to both sets of questions asked above would be that language is innate. It's in the brain. You're born with it. And that isn't to say that German babies are born with German in their brain, but we are all born with an innate capacity for languages, and that capacity is structured in a specific way that shapes what languages can be. This innate capacity would explain why children can learn languages so quickly. It would also explain why very different languages conform to a set of rules. This set of rules is called principles and parameters, and we'll discuss these in another video. So, here's where the innateness hypothesis comes in. The innateness hypothesis is the hypothesis that children have a biologically endowed, innate language faculty. So let's take this apart a bit. It's biologically endowed and it's innate. They're born with it, everybody is. And it's a language faculty. It's a faculty specific to languages. We're not making claims of other types of competence, or intelligence being innate. The belief is that language learning is different in kind from any other type of learning which human beings experience, so that learning a language involves mental processes entirely distinct from those involved in learning to play chess or learning to ride a bicycle. This is a quote from Radford, 1997. And so it's a biologically endowed language faculty that children have. Notice the claim isn't being made that adults still have this language faculty. The discussion of what happens to the language faculty as we age is looked at under another hypothesis called the critical period hypothesis, which we're not going to talk about now. This hypothesis relates to the study of syntax in a number of ways. Through the study of syntax, linguists hope to gain insight into this language faculty. How is it set up? What does it do? What exactly is innate? As the language faculty relates to language in general, not specific languages, the language faculty constrains and makes possible many different languages, and understanding the possibilities of the language faculty means gaining insight into the universal grammar, or the very many different possibilities that different languages can manifest. The way in which this language faculty would operate is that the child experiences language in their environment This experience of language acts as input to the language faculty, which then tells the child subconsciously how to process, interpret, understand, and produce language, shaping that child's grammar. Thus, writes Radford, the input to the language faculty is the child's experience, and the output of the language faculty is a grammar of the language being acquired. So, what evidence do we have to support the innateness hypothesis? One bit of evidence comes from the uniformity and rapidity in children's linguistic development. Children learn their first word by the age of 12 months, the single word stage continues for about 6 months, and there's little evidence of grammatical development until around 18 months. But then children start producing plurals, two-word utterances, and otherwise demonstrating some grammatical development. By 30 months, approximately a year later, children have acquired most of the inflections and core constructions of their language. They've still got a lot of work to do, but they have the basics. Why is it that this pattern of development, well, it does vary, is relatively common? How can we explain the fact that children achieve certain things with language in similar ways? You may have heard some counter-arguments already, but the view that children come pre-programmed with a language system is a predominant one in linguistics. This explains the speed in which children acquire language, but also the uniformity in the times at which they acquire specific aspects of syntax and morphology. The argument is that there must be an innate language faculty because it's impossible to explain the speed of acquisition in any other way. So the uniformity and the patterns of acquisition are cited as evidence of an innate language faculty, but so is the uniformity in the types of grammar. The types of input are going to vary widely, but children do end up coming up with very similar grammars. There are differences, but the similarities are far greater than could ever be explained on the basis of the input. Children of the same age are much more likely to come up with different answers to a math problem than they are to come up with different answers to forming yes or no questions, different ways of forming yes or no questions. Further support for the innateness hypothesis comes from the poverty of the stimulus argument. Their argument goes like this. How is it that children are able to learn so much so fast with so little evidence? Children learn to do things that they are not taught. But more significantly, they learn not to do things that they were not taught to do. If there were some kind of linguistic faculty guiding language development, if there were not some kind of linguistic faculty guiding language development, then why would children avoid certain structures that are ungrammatical in any language? They can be very creative with their first language, but they don't violate certain general rules. And yet, they seem to know not to violate these rules, despite the fact that most parents rarely, if ever, explicitly correct children's grammar. So the poverty of the stimulus argument basically says they haven't been given enough information to come up with the answers they've come up with. And they haven't been given enough negative evidence to know that certain things aren't allowed. Not only is the input children receive inadequate to explain their level of acquisition, it's also often very poor. They are exposed to lots of interruptions, false starts, disconnected speech, asides, baby talk, ungrammatical structures, but they still end up coming up with something fairly grammatical at the end. Another argument for the innateness hypothesis is that language capacity seems to be independent of intelligence. Even individuals with major developmental disorders still have an ability to use language that outstrips their ability to do other things. If language was a problem to be solved, without a language faculty supporting the problem solving, then there would be many more humans who simply couldn't do it. Even people with serious cognitive impairments can produce language which has a level of complexity that should be beyond them. Another argument in favor of the language faculty being innate is that learning seems to be subconscious and involuntary. Children acquire languages without a great deal of effort and without a great deal of guidance, and without even being consciously aware of what they're doing. Children acquire languages without much effort being made to teach them languages. An earlier perspective on language learning was the behavioristic perspective, and a behavioristic perspective on learning says that animals and humans acquire habits as responses to specific stimuli. Something happens, we respond, and that response is reinforced or not reinforced. The predominance of behavioristic psychology led to an understanding of language learning as habit formation, and language teaching as involving repetition, imitation, and reinforcement. Modern syntax argues that this perspective cannot be correct, and that language cannot be due to habit formation. So how do we know that language learning and language acquisition are innate as opposed to habit formation? If language were habit formation, how could we account for our ability to recognize the grammaticality and non-grammaticality of different sentences that we've never heard before? Despite never having encountered a sentence, we can tell it's incorrect, and that can't be due to habit formation. More evidence that language learning isn't simply habit formation is the rule generalization that children do. Children produce past tense forms such as comed and goed despite never having heard them before. They're generalizing the rule that to make the past tense form of a verb one adds an ed ending. So creativity and generalization of rules and hypothesis testing seems much more important part of language than habit formation. Finally, children also produce novel sentences and structures that they've never heard anyone say to them before. The three of these things together, the ability to recognize the ungrammaticality of novel sentences, the ability to generalize rules, and the ability to produce novel sentences and structures, demonstrates that language learning is not essentially habit formation. Finally, more evidence that suggests language learning is more creative than imitative comes from studies of children. One of these studies is now popularly known as the WUG test. So let's see if you can pass the WUG test. This is a WUG. There is one WUG. Now there are two. There are two. Did you answer WUGs? Now, did you pronounce it wugs or wugs? Wugs or wugs? Have you ever seen a wug before? Have you ever heard of a wug before? Your ability to add the plural s and to use the voice pronunciation of it, z, was not due to imitation because you've never heard of a wug before. Even very young children are able to come to the same conclusion as you did, showing that they do not learn languages solely through imitation. They've never heard the plural of wug before, but they come up with it through some kind of creative process. So, in summary, the evidence points to support for the innateness hypothesis, the hypothesis that children are born with the biologically endowed capacity for learning languages, as opposed to a behaviorist perspective that sees it as habit formation. That children have this innate capacity helps to explain another one of our questions, which is why are languages so similar? Why do they seem to have a universal grammar?